Hello everyone, today we talk about the 18th century French artillery reforms, one of the most important chapters in the history of the modern art of war, given that France was not just the tendentially hegemonic continental power in Europe, but also its gold standard in terms of military quality overall as a system. You could look at different armies, of course, the one of Frederick II during the 7 Years' War and beyond, saying, well, that there was some quality there, but the French military at large was the most powerful, was the one that had to handle more, challenges at a time in a broader sense, also just to keep up, as we will understand today, with the rest of the world. From this position, it was in fact heavily terrestrially based. France would, of course, get into pretty global overseas wars, as we've seen also from the videos about British strategy during the 7 Years' War. We will see in the end what happens during the War of U.S. independence regarding the outcome of this French military, especially artillery reforms, but not only, because it was a comprehensive one. And so we should first of all enter this mindset of recognition of French standards, but also the even more gigantic quality in being able to step up to an incredibly efficient military system that in the mid-century had instead started to lag behind, procuring the French, in fact, also pretty important losses. Right, we talked about Louis XIV's army in general. We've seen also some aspects of military doctrine, especially infantry fire from the late 17th, beginning of the 18th century. We talked about Maurice de Saxe, and so the greatest pages of glory, the French military in that first half of the 18th century. We talked Vauban and how, of course, he had laid the foundations for European siegecraft during the era. We also looked at pretty, brutal pages or bloody pages for the French, and not only military history, in the video about the Mousquetaires de la Maison de Roi, that highlighted a bit also the contrast between the sort of the more traditional knightly lifestyle of the French nobility and these pressing doctrinal and technological and broader sort of military reforming needs. We observed that this is true essentially of every power during every era. We tend not to see it too much when we talk about ancient or medieval warfare. There we actually tend to look at, as it was also in this era, and it is also in our own, the fundamentally essential homogeneity that actually exists between armed forces, showing how technology, of course, per se is not even nearly or imaginably nearly the determinant, the decisive factor. On the other hand, however, all these powers were at this point accelerating in this, fixing and improving reforms, because we are in a time in history, in fact, in which the acceleration in the art of war development is reaching unprecedented heights, and it will continue more or less up to this day. Of course, there are ups and downs, there are moments of stagnation, but everything is relative compared to systems that, however, are also quite much expanding in absolute terms. We've seen how this, especially from the Von Kriege series, generated a need for actual theoretical manualistic production that would, to be positively applied, especially in thinking doctrine, military reforms, but also properly military thought, as up to the previous century, this had been almost irrelevant in terms of actual applicability of the same concept. Generals learned, armies developed, states sort of change on their military postures on the basis of the contingental situation, would learn along the way, and there was no need to inform the system with sort of more forward-thinking, say future-thinking conceptions more than much. We will see today, of course, how painful these reforms could be, especially for such a big power like France, but it's still very instructive to show you what civilization is capable of doing. Now, We'll also come back, of course, in French 18th century warfare. It's really needed. So many levels I'll start to make also 18th century battle videos, because frankly that's something I lack on Schwerpunkt for reasons that we'll explain, if anything, in another moment. But it's important really to enucleate this period in as an era of its own, like the development of linear warfare, the guerre en dentelle, to a degree that contrasts, in fact, with this idea of modernization that the Enlightenment has somehow been mostly represented ex post as, and all a series of other considerations that you can check out also in my now growing 18th century history playlist. Right, so we can say that the equipment utilized by the French military was originally crafted and produced to meet the demands of the wars of the early 18th century. It had been the moment of major power display of France at the peak, essentially, of the conflicts, mostly pivoting around the crucial figure of the Sun King Louis XIV. It was veritably a solar mass in terms of revolution of all the other European powers around. Through some, in fact, the bloodiest pages in military history, the French had fundamentally been successful, right? Other systems, you will see it now, had sort of improved on some more qualitative aspects, exactly to stem the French tide that, as such, could simply make leverage on what was, say, in terms of individual quality, just a lower standard, but that actually should be measured on the basis of the bigger system that was capable of also achieving critical results for everybody involved. Then we know that, philosophically speaking, doctrinally, after the War of Spanish Succession, armies tended to shrink in size from this enormity that of the hundreds of thousands of the beginning of the year that had been, in fact, from the second half of the 17th century, yet another era on its own. And so, in many ways, this is also something that one should really take into very serious consideration when you think about adaptation, innovation, also scientific development, economical possibilities, etc. There are human sort of mental forms that are sometimes more difficult to change than the actual practice. This could easily digress towards something more philosophical and religious and of the traditional kind, but I will not do so. In any case, we can say that the French military had somehow stopped. Of course, this is an approximation, but it had rested, let's say better, largely on the accomplishments provided by the model of the first half of the 18th century. That, as we were saying before, also was kind of fine, because from a decade to another, yes, much could change, but you could still rest on the same fundamentals. We've seen it also, in fact, in the video about Maurice de Saxe, that comes to save a bit like the French military, just out of his personal capacity and charisma and coup d'oeil and so on, in moments where the French had, in fact, not really been particularly bright. And by the 60s of the 18th century, we realized that along this path, both personal armaments and artillery in the French military had become entirely, or at least particularly, obsolete, right, necessitating an immediate overhaul of the military's ordnance. Again, I will not enter in the details of this. We'll surely make other videos to be more annoying in terms of nuance and detail. But you understand the bigger pattern here. Today we'll not talk just about artillery, because that's sort of the most famous thing, the passage from the Vallière to the Gribeauval. But we're talking firepower in general, which is a topic we will also give a further look at in a bit along the pattern of that sort of comparison between country and country. By the way, I made multiple videos about the Prussian infantry, specifically, of Frederick the Great, that analyze in depth also that almost primitivity of the Prussian system that relied, in fact, on much sort of more moral aspect. We've seen how fond the old Fritz was of bayonet charges, for example, how he had to change his mind and that stuff. And he was actually a guy that had a very, effervescent intellect in many ways, so he could adapt better in that way. But against the Austrians in the later century, he had to understand that artillery, and that's why also this connects to today's topic, was really, taking on another level of importance. It's not even like the Austrians were, in fact, the greatest firepower here, because at that point the French had fixed most of their problems. But talking about muskets even, right, the French model 1754 represented indeed a development from its predecessor, the model 1728, whereas the artillery relied still on the Vallière system. This is a famous name at the French court. You're surely aware of Madame de la Vallière. There's another story, a bit of gossiping of the dance of Versailles, so to say. But these were, of course, all the noblemen that we described in other videos, being part of the French military according to specific systems of promotion, of hierarchy, of status, and so on. De Vallière was the guy who gave the name to this artillery system that did the form, dating to October the 7th, 1732. Right, Jean-Florent de Vallière had been born in 1667. He would die in 1759. His career began among the miners, right, the French military, in 1690. That's a hell of an era, basically the peak of Louis the 14th France expansion, adventurism. There is a lot of siege warfare we've seen in multiple videos, and we will come back on that because I have something planned on Marlborough. We will talk about Prince Eugene again soon. Was definitely a moment of great siegecraft, again, the age of Vauban, where the French excelled, to make long story short. And so at the time, of course, this system had developed from the best auspices, except now it had sort of started to lag behind as well. Vallière had, I think, survived the siege of Turin, right? The masterpiece, the famous, one of the many famous masterpieces of Prince Eugene, that was studied heavily, basically. The same Prussian military was heavily informed by Eugene's, tactics, operations in that battle later from observers from all over Europe, right? The French had lost, but also from defeats you get hell, in fact, of experiences. And Vallière had advanced to colonel inspector of artillery in 1720, eventually reaching the rank of general in 1732. He had served as the Director General of Artillery, devising a framework that restricted the French army's artillery calibers to 5. These are very famous, the 4, 8, 12, 16, and 24 pounders. And the mortar types were 2 in this system, the 8 and the 12 inches. This artillery system had the advantage of establishing essentially uniform calibers across the French forces. Up to that point, in fact, most European militaries had not really accomplished that much. Again, made lots of videos about, say, 17th century warfare at large. We talked about innovation in artillery technology and all this stuff. So, especially in function of siege warfare, what seemed actually a further staticization, not much of a fluidification. We think, in fact, of linear tactics appearing, etc. But I made a video explaining how it's essentially not until the 7 Years' War that what we call linear tactics came fully into maturity. Right, they were there, but most warfare also revolved around sieges, and this was a big problem for the same doctrine. But that's where the French had prevailed, had been the bigger power, with a greater terrestrial focus, attacking areas like, think about Flanders, United Provinces, etc. So those battlefields that in the history of Europe have been, really like the Bible, like knowing every single inch of it for all the sieges, all the encounters that took place in that. Let's say, being the best ground for mostly siege artillery development. This is, in fact, what the Vallière system, at the end of the day, was about, as we'll understand better now. In fact, one of the faults of this system, or at least one that had become apparent in the following generations, is that it lacked differentiation in carriages and transport mechanisms between pieces intended, in fact, only most for fortresses and those for field use, because the latter, in particular, were not interesting the French more than much. There was, as we just said initially, not this dramatic dynamism regarding the use of field artillery, and the French had concentrated on range, precision, probably within siege warfare. These artillery units were, by the way, notably cumbersome, restricting their maneuverability during combat itself, so that the French simply had not developed that part. Right? Of course, there was a level of handiness in some way, but compared to other European systems, things were different. In 1761, the Swiss cannon maker Jean II Maritz stripped away all superfluous decorations from the cannons he crafted, yet their heft remained burdensome. It was properly the type of caliber that had remained to a mostly static kind of employment during the bombardment of fortresses. Jean Maritz was a Swiss cannon maker with a significant connection to the French army through his innovative contributions to cannon manufacturing. The father proper had been, because there were generations of military advisors and producers and technologists, etc., had been born in 1680 in Burgdorf, a canton of Bern. Maritz moved to France and became the commissaire de fond, so the commissioner of the king's foundry at Strasbourg. That, as you know, that he came from German Switzerland. Strasbourg had been one of, in fact, of the major centers stripped from Germany by the French during the glorious campaigns on the Rhine by Louis XIV, and it was also connected, would be the burial place of the Saint Maurice de Saxe. In fact, it was a Protestant city, and it hosted this massive royal foundries. Strasbourg, if you ever visit, I was there a couple of times. It's one of the most beautiful cities in the region. It's loaded in properly heavy culture. It's properly this at the frontier, the French, the German, the Italian world. It has this beautiful fortifications dating mostly from the time. There are beautiful museums, including about the army, etc. So if you go there, please notice this. And as far as Jean Maritz, his most notable impact came from inventing the vertical drilling machine in 1713, and later refining it to the horizontal drilling machine around 1734. These inventions, as you understand, they are in parallel to the Vallière system, because the standards of Jean Maritz were the same ones used, as we've seen, for the aforementioned list of pounders of Vallière system, and they dramatically boosted for further cannon making by allowing for more precise and efficient bores, replacing older, less accurate methods of casting around a clay core. This was functional to the Vallière, to the French doctrine incarnated by the Vallière system, because this precision was mostly unflexible. Again, it had to confer that particular capacity at long range for hitting the right parts of the enemy fortifications. So it was all functionalized to that kind of employment. Hence, we're talking big, unwieldy pieces that were not properly conceived for competing with other powers in open field engagements. Maritz's technique were adopted by the French army, becoming, as we've just said, the cornerstone of the Vallière system, established under, as we've seen, Jean de Vallière. The Jean we talked about before is Jean Maritz II, or Jean II Maritz, furthered his father's legacy, becoming Inspector General of the gun foundries in 1755 in Strasbourg and continuing to refine the horizontal boring process. As we will see, both Jean Maritz and Vallière were following in their respective fathers' footsteps that were evidently intertwined, defending their legacy, right, and leading, as we will understand better, for the faction of the Reds and the Blues in the French military to an interesting friction that would actually also cause distress within the same reform and partly, at least for a while, in the French military. That would eventually land in the right place, but again, there was resistance within the system. Importantly enough, the lack of wieldy open field firepower within the Vallière system was exemplified by the lack of standardized howitzer types. The French did have them, but they had not been formally uniformed to any particular caliber. So the howitzer, is a hybrid weapon, fundamentally blending traits of mortars and cannons, which at this point were actually relatively common among other European forces. Right, the howitzer was designed to launch essentially explosive projectiles along a steep trajectory. So it had a very anti-personnel function, especially in open field with the thickly compact musketeers lines. And its ammo comprised a cast iron ball packed with a powder charge set to detonate after a specific delay, activated by a fuse. This fuse was a hollow cylinder crafted from wood or metal, holding a black powder trail. The detonation timing of the bomb's explosive was dictated by length of this powder trail, of course ignited by the flash from the propellant charge exploding within the howitzer's barrel at the moment of fire. Though it didn't match the destructive or lethal power of contemporary artillery shells that concentrated mostly in smashing power, in fact had historically developed in the history of the art of war for anti-fortification purpose, this ammo significantly disrupted troops enduring such barrages, as we explained it on multiple occasions. You could have within it interesting stuff like musket balls, quicklime. Open field engagements did witness an anti-human, let's say, function, but even the howitzers' main targets were not much the infantry in open terrain, but rather those sheltered in civilian structures capable of being ignited by the blasts, right? So the same fortifications at times. Also cavalry units, as horses appeared especially susceptible to the shells, startled by the explosive roars, while the barrel's caliber permitted greater use of canister shot than typical ordnance. So there were different ways of employing them. Let's say warfare was not revolving around howitzers, but as we will learn now, some European countries, exactly to increase losses in properly enemy personnel, and if you look at France as the bigger power that was throwing, this is a meme, but it was throwing men compared to other powers that had smaller armies, right, tended to try to impale as enemy as possible in this, also what tended to be mostly a defensive posture, right, especially in open field. But if you target cavalry, because it's difficult actually even to simply target, but if you have this sort of shrapnel, this broader halo effect after the explosion, that's something cavalry is also smaller. But again, most artillery was fitting siege warfare. And in fact, in open field, the best arms you could use were, in fact, infantry and cavalry. Artillery, of course, helping as well, but being actually the least important of the three. Right? The text of reference for the stuff is the beautiful, that the frontispiece of which I use because it's very funny, is L'art de jeter les bombes, par Monsieur Blondel Marshal de Camp aux armées du roi, ci-devant maître de mathématiques de Monsieur Le Dauphin, published in Paris in 1683. And you see this guy is literally surrounded by guns that shoot, and he throws bombs all around. And so the art of throwing bombs, which seems pretty fitting for this, from that older, in this case, as you understand, late 17th century text that had made school, by the way. Indeed, howitzers which fire in a higher arc to lob explosive shells over obstacles were less prioritized in this system, the Vallière system, because the French doctrine, as we've seen, leaned heavily on direct fire cannons and mortars for siege work. Right, mortars already in widespread use overlapped with howitzers in function, high-angle fire, potentially reducing the perceived need even for a distinct howitzer type early on. Here, we're sort of highlighting the differences of the different systems, but it's not like these were this overwhelming deal. It's not like the French had forgotten, we didn't think to develop howitzers. Just in their view, that they wouldn't need so many or to standardize them. So when we look at our period here by the mid-18th century, fundamentally, the French had actually adopted and produced howitzers, often influenced by the same foreign designs that were being pioneered by other countries. For instance, during the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740-1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, the latter, as we've seen, is the moment even in time when Vallière dies, French forces encountered Prussian and Austrian howitzers, which were more systematically integrated into their armies. The Prussians, under Frederick the Great, and the Austrians with their Liechtenstein system, that was the Vallière of the Habsburgs, had refined lighter, more mobile howitzers for battlefield use. The French, while innovative with cannon boring, as we've seen thanks to Jean Maritz, were slower to emphasize howitzers as a separate, specialized class until later reforms, essentially until Gribeauval, as we will see now. Now, just to flash this, like only in barrel production, in casting methods, did French arsenals truly excel, right? Owing to innovations by the aforementioned Maritz, and departing from earlier practices, barrels had been, in fact, cast solid and then drilled using a specialized machine invented by the latter, by the Swiss founder. And this approach enhanced manufacturing precision and reduced barrel windage, which is especially a matter of increasing precision on the long run, right? We can say it again. French doctrine heavily emphasized sieges. Think Louis XIV's campaigns or Vauban's fortifications. Precise, powerful cannons were vital for breaching walls or defending fortresses. Maritz's methods enhanced barrel strength and accuracy, making French artillery better suited for these prolonged technical engagements compared to less consistent foreign designs. Right? France had this overarching offensive capacity, and so they invested a lot in that. Right? They did think, as we said at the beginning, a bigger scale. Right? That's what really served a bigger purpose, because strategically they were the stronger. All right. So even as the Dutch, as the English, may have sort of more qualitative systems, but they are designed also for a smaller scale and intensity, so to say, of engagement. In particular, windage, we mentioned now, is the gap between a cannonball and the inner wall of the barrel. So, it's self-explanatory. Like in older casting methods where barrels were molded around a core, the bore often ended up uneven or slightly oversized. Again, I made videos explaining how they fixed this. Some Savoyard artillerists literally inserted ceramics inside the barrel together with the bowl, so to fix this kind of excesses that would perturb the trajectory from the moment of the shot. And so this left, windage with left excessive space around the projectiles, causing several problems. Maritz had fundamentally fixed this issue, so increasing again on a essentially siege artillery bombardment performance. By 1760, in fact, he had standardized bronze composition across the Kingdom of France and deployed 26 drilling machines driven by 11 mills distributed through the realm. Think about the socioeconomical impact of this as well. Now, let's say, what can we... Well, let's say this, that in the War of the Austrian Succession, like the optimal strategy for deploying Vallière artillery involved fortifying them in strategically advantageous locations to target the enemies with a lethal range, right? So from the distance, pounding them without any specific refinement at closer range against smaller targets in the same, fortification structures represent. Thus, instead, frontline demands grew more insistent for these guns to support battalions during offensive operations, because essentially the French started to lack in an art of war that was sort of fluidifying, like reducing the importance of fortresses, that mostly infantry firepower support that naturally would much more easily and effectively be delivered by smaller guns that had to be adaptable and quick to move, right? Smaller calibers with particular technologies, as we see, including the howitzers, one for harming specific targets. That's where Joseph Laurent de Vallière, 1776, comes into play. This is the son of the system's namesake, right? So their father and son, assuming command of the battalions and artillery schools in 1747, right? It would be interesting to look at the proper military career of these officers throughout all what we've seen with Maurice de Saxe, etc. The various wars that were being fought. There were many in the 18th century. That's why we have to get a bit more into that more detailed, in-depth kind of nitty-gritty military annals. Now, Vallière's son's traditional mindset and unwavering faith in his father's designs compelled Louis XV, the current ruler's forces, to confront opponents in the 7 Years' War with antiquated equipment. So we do not open the parentheses of the 7 Years' War. I made a video about the essentially the North American frontier, mostly from the British side, but obviously talking about the French. It's not even like the French were bad, but in general, like these problems began to emerge in that war that was a debacle for France in the end from a broader political and strategical point of view. It wasn't much a matter of tactical issues, but these technicalities began to emerge, having compounded the issues at a point. The standard field gun the French used was a 4-pounder cannon, its barrel weighing 560 kilos and capable of firing a 2 tons projectile. Right, so we're talking about massive guns. In contrast, its rivals, like the Austrians, because again, there is of course a continental front, 3-pounder model 1753 and the Prussian 3-pounder model 1768 weighed 240 and 280. Right, the rivals, of course, the Austrians are allied with the French during the 7 Years' War, but say the rivals in terms of who is using what and how. So we realize something much more wieldy, much smaller pieces that are basically less than half the French ones. We're talking barrel here, and that shot projectiles of respectively like the Austrians 1600, the Prussians 1400 kilos. So as a consequence, you understand the agility and firepower of these adversaries in the broader competitions of power stunned French leadership. And that's where the problem began to be properly manifest, right? We will, again, soon I have already a special dedicated to actually one of the few French victories against the Germans during the 7 Years' War. But this is also the moment in the literal war in which Jean-Baptiste de Gribeauval, so this very famous name, talented French artillery officer, serving in the Austrian forces during the 7 Years' War, as the French were allied with the Austrians, held the rank of Oberstleutnant. By 1762, Gribeauval had risen to Generalfeldwachtmeister, and between August the 8th and October the 9th, 1762, excelled as an Habsburgic artillery commander defending the Schweidnitz fortress in Silesia against Prussian forces. These are all things we've seen also in the videos about Frederick the Great regarding the importance of artillery. So what had happened in this siege? Gribeauval's role was pivotal as the chief engineer and artillery commander there, leveraging his expertise to bolster the fortress's defenses against a Prussian force of approximately 13,500 men under Lieutenant General Townsend, backed by Frederick the Great's himself strategic oversight. The siege began with the Prussians encircling Schweidnitz and initiating a bombardment on August the 9th, targeting key fortifications like the Jaurnica and Bergen forts. Gribeauval's artillery response was vigorous and effective. His cannons, strategically placed within the fortress's robust works, maintained a lively counterfire that slowed Prussian progress. This was no small feat, given that Schweidnitz was a well-fortified position, with a garrison of around 12,000 Austrians, ample provisions, and a significant artillery complement which Gribeauval expertly directed. One of his standout contributions was thwarting Prussian attempts at mining under the fortress walls. The Prussians, under engineer Simon Deodat Lefebvre, sought to undermine key defenses like the Bergen fort, but Gribeauval's engineering acumen, honed from his earlier work establishing the Austrian Sapper Corps, by the way, just to show you also how advanced the French were for these noblemen, these officers, these advisors to inform the same as Habsburgic forces that were not really among the least in Europe, allowed him to counter these efforts effectively. He directed repairs to existing mines and likely organized counter-mining operations disrupting Prussian plans and forcing them to rely on prolonged bombardment rather than a swift breach. This defensive tenacity inflicted heavy casualties, around 7,000 Prussians, which is insane. It tells you, by the way, the Prussian resolve and what kind of warfare was going on during the 7 Years' War. I mean, the Prussians were famous for that, but we're talking also about 1,000 Austrian losses. This is not a few, especially considering that they were defending, earning praise even from Frederick the Great, who was impressed enough to offer the same Gribeauval a position in Prussian service, which Gribeauval declined. This tells you also, again, how romantically traditional and chivalrous and supernational, and of course, culture was at the time among the nobility, the traditional order bears. Now, the fortress's defenses, enhanced by Gribeauval's leadership, held out for 2 months despite intense pressure. The Prussian bombardment escalated, and by early October, their mining efforts culminated in a devastating explosion of the garrison's gunpowder magazine on October the 8th, likely a result of a successful Prussian mine rather than a direct failure of Gribeauval's countermeasures. This catastrophe crippled the Austrian ability to resist further, and on October the 9th, Moscow capitulated, surrendering the garrison as prisoners of war after Frederick rejected terms allowing them to march out with honors. Gribeauval's performance, however, was not diminished by the outcome. His technical skill and stubborn defense had maximized the fortress's resistance, delaying Frederick's campaign in Silesia, and costing him, in fact, dearly in men and time. This episode was very famous, and Maria Theresia was so impressed by Gribeauval herself to elevate this capable officer to Feldmarschall Lieutenant, also awarding him of the Grand Cross of the Military Order of Maria Theresia from the Empress herself, right? Really reflecting Austria's recognition of Gribeauval's exceptional expertise. This was the man who would, in fact, the Gribeauval system, we will talk about it mostly. It's the one that made Napoleon, right? To make the long story short, the quality of the French Revolutionary Army, the Napoleonic one, was greatly bolstered by Gribeauval's reform. So we're talking, again, top French military culture at its best. Now, upon returning to France in 1763, despite recruitment efforts by Frederick II and Maria Theresa, as we've seen, Gribeauval was awarded the rank of Maréchal de Camp, the Order of Saint-Louis Cross, and the role of Inspector General of Artillery by Louis XV. While Vallière was in Spain, by the way, because that's the moment in which issues start within the same France, supervising the innovation of King Charles III's weaponry. You know that Spain and France were buddies at this point after the War of Spanish Succession. The Duke of Choiseul, the Minister of War in France, granted the new Inspector General, Gribeauval, full authority to revamp France's outdated artillery. Moving to Strasbourg, Gribeauval assembled technicians and officers at the local arsenal, collaborating with them to design new barrels and carriages for field, siege, fortress, and coastal applications. This is where practically, technically, concretely, the Gribeauval system was made. Right. In the meanwhile, this innovation was endorsed by the Ministry of War and officially approved by the King on August the 13th, 1765. The Gribeauval system equipped the French military with the era's finest artillery resources. This is what we're talking about at the beginning. This is what France, as the greatest power in Europe, could and would reform its artillery, given her primary, again, continental terrestrial focus, not only, but mostly, blending mobility, firing speed, and destructive power seamlessly. Right? The art of war was really changing again towards less fortresses, more dynamic campaigns, larger open field engagements, by the way, that had gradually been returning since the time of the War of Spanish Succession. The reform introduced field cannons of 12, 8, and 4 pounds per shot, alongside 6-inch howitzers. So you understand here there is a further simplification of the calibers and a final care and optimization of the howitzer type. For siege efforts or fortress protection, cannons of 24 and 16 pounds were crafted, fitted onto tailored positional carriages complemented by 12 and 10-inch mortars. By the way, the French siege capacities were not neglected at all, and they would stay in line with expectations of such an ambitious project. There were even the 15-inch petard mortars. We'll talk about these some other time. Was looked up to by all military analysts, observers, so to say, realizing that if France could field such firepower now, the battlefields of Europe would, and not just those, would have increased in relevance. Consider their years here, right? This is after the French defeat in the 7 Years' War. So here the French are even more motivated to improve the quality of their military performance. This will be, as we will see ourselves now, displayed in support of the U.S. Army. Now we're talking here, as you understand, prepared ammo, bundling the charge, wadding projectile, all cutting reloading time so drastically that an 8-man team could unleash 15 rounds in a minute using an 8-pounder. This is insane, right? Nobody had ever achieved this in such a large scale with such order and uniformity. Again, the result was astonishing. By the way, it's not like the French didn't take from others. For example, the elevation screw the French used at this had been imitated from the Austrian model 1753, Reichsmaschine. It wasn't the same. It was unique, again, to the French system. It now was to be a gold standard for generations. So it was understood like a new era of warfare, enhancing aiming precision, by the way, with this latter elements as well. The performance was really impressive. Whereas artillery in the early 18th century had a range just over 600 meters, these newer designs could strike beyond 2 kilometers with a practical range of roughly 800 meters. So again, step by step, but enhancing dramatically technology and especially rendering doctrine more complex. This means that there wasn't just more power around, but there was also more chance to exploit different avenues during battles, during operations. Such capabilities rendered light artillery within infantry regiments unnecessary for boosting frontline power, by the way. The carriages and barrels stood out for their maneuverability and comparative lightness. The Gribeauval 4-pounders barrel weighed something between 290 and 270 lighter than a Vallière cannon of equivalent caliber, which is a lot, really. Ultimately, a decision was made to standardize all wooden and metal parts of the carriages and towing vehicles, which meant that basically all the artillery of France was standardized, uniform. This is a great step further in the history of the art of war, because up to this point, that full standardization and uniformity had not really properly kicked in, right? There is a standard of modernity that the same French had began under Louis XIV, whose technological interest was paradoxically not that high, because again, the French power as such, in the way it was complexly, collectively articulated, discipline, etc., was beyond that. For example, the French adopted the bayonet later than other powers, right? Because it wasn't properly the most important focus in there. At this point, instead, we really enter, if you want, with the Gribeauval system, a contemporary order of ideas as far as military technology was concerned. Upon Joseph Laurent de Vallière's return to France in 1764, so this again after the 7 Years' War, the latter learned, much to his chagrin, that Choiseul had no intention, the Minister of War, no intention of restoring him as Director General of Artillery, that he had once been. This was a huge issue among noblemen that, as we've seen, had invested so much of their image, also politically, their military competence abroad, or because of their father's legacy, or like in Gribeauval's case, out of proper, military genius capacity, to be simply accepted. So there's a ridge here that forms that is basically caused by the various influential court allies, especially backing Vallière, who sought to undermine Gribeauval's reforms. This division within the French army took the name of colors like the Reds backing Vallière and the Blues championing Gribeauval. The Reds enlisted support from infantry comrades, interestingly enough, who begrudgingly parted with their regimental guns. In other words, they were not convinced, just by habit, by guts, but in this case, not by faith and more innovative thinking, and in fact, mirroring capacity and vision, that Gribeauval's system would have actually provided them with greater firepower, a more effectively deployable one. this was the level of resistance, the level of sclerosis, also in mentality, for many reasons. Surely there were many infantrymen who understood the potential that this reform created. But again, this had also to be adopted, to be implemented, which, as we'll learn here, wouldn't happen until 1776 to the fullest. But mostly because of these high-level hostilities, antagonism. Promises that artillery would continue aiding infantry and that the new system offered superior firepower failed to sway opinions among these infantry officers. Still, the Reds' campaign faltered initially, leading to Vallière's deployment to Naples in 1770. And again, the guy was competent in his own field. Naples was allied with Austria, with France. They were dealing with the Barbary pirates. Naples, they needed also this French military advising, the many fortifications of the kingdom. So he was sent to the south. Vallière was sent to the south on purpose to avoid, literally as a sort of punishment, because the Red faction here did not make it to gain prevalence at the Ministry of War. However, that's where things changed in 1771 when the Marquis de Montagnard takes over after Choiseul. A firm proponent of reducing military spending, Montagnard reinstated Vallière as director. This doesn't sound very good. Powers like France shouldn't behave like this. We know how dangerous, harming this continuity is in a way or another. Reverting to the old system, of course, demanded fewer troops. This was the general policy of the Minister of War. Essentially savings. We are in the 70s. Here, France is actually suffering still from the 7 Years' War aftermath. And soon they will actually get into further military ventures that will cost a lot, and, as you know, triggering further the rise of the monstrous public debt that France had, and eventually would lead, in part, among the other things, to the revolution itself. And of course, Gribeauval's reform had cost, right? And the troops here were reduced from 8,500 to 4,500, yielding substantial savings. So we're talking the artillery here. Economic logic does not go well along with military one, regardless of course, the fact that having an effective military cost, but that's exactly the reason. If you're just playing to save just to save, you're just an idiot, right? You must invest how much it's really needed in your defense and to keep it effective, like Gribeauval's system was. Whereas here, the Vallière's one was reinstated with the order of August the 23rd, 1772. This caused, by the way, a broader jam in the military and in some other aspects of French, at this point, industrial policy, essentially, because recasting the new ordinance, so reconstructing carriages and returning to prior tactical doctrines, was even just ridiculous at this point. I mean, you had finally allowed for the full standardization of the entire artillery, rendered the doctrine and its applicability way more advantageous and effective. What do? You come back to a system that you have, even just to spend more time re-diversifying, as opposed to the system that is, again, a pretty darn good one that is already standing. This also brings to the fall of Montagnard from the Ministry of War, because he was unable, because of his own incompetence, to address the chaos that this inversion of March had caused. In fact, he was ousted in 1774, and after this, you had 4 marshals of France, veterans of the 7 Years' War, namely Richelieu, Contade, Soubise, and Broglie, convening to decide the path forward, which definitely went in favor of the Gribeauval system, was reinstated for good, because these French commanders were, of course, very competent in their own experience, and they keenly remembered that the Vallière system had posed a myriad of issues. The bulky cannons were just so complicated to move on the field, and they were not really effective in the type of war that was being fought here at different levels, different distances, and different theaters, by the way. So the marshals decided to reinstate the Gribeauval system wisely. So wisely, in fact, that the system would prove as effective until 1829. Right, so the Gribeauval system goes on throughout, again, the French intervention in the War of U.S. independence, during the French Revolutionary Wars, during the Napoleonic Wars. Let's stress this. Like Gribeauval, we said before, the Gribeauval system is a contemporary military reform, right? But it was ahead of its times because France was not yet a contemporary state. That would become only under Napoleon after the revolution. This system was so ahead of its time, but already so effective in the moment, also because there wasn't any major conflagration in Europe, basically in the years following the 7 Years' War, for which the French had sort of to bother themselves too much about their doctrine. And it wasn't, again, the Gribeauval system wasn't ahead in its time, meaning that it was anachronistic even. But the Napoleonic Wars were a totally different scale, and the Gribeauval system was fully fitting for it. Napoleon, as an artillery officer, I made an entire video about the Napoleonic use of artillery, was literally brought up, right, trained, schooled in Gribeauval's doctrine and methods. So without Gribeauval, there wouldn't even have been Napoleon, literally. Joseph Florent de Vallière, in the meanwhile, was naturally pretty abated, but he, for this reason, didn't want to lose face and persisted in opposing the new ordinance reestablishing the Gribeauval system until his death in 1776. In fact, it's at this point that basically nobody opposed the system anymore. Vallière was prolific. He wrote a lot, voicing his dissent against Gribeauval. For example, we have the Mémoire touchant la supériorité des pièces d'artillerie longues et solides sur les pièces courtes et légères. So literally, a memoir touching on the superiority of the longer and more solid pieces of artillery, so the ones that his father, literally, in the times, like just after the first half of the 18th century, had standardized over the pièces courtes et légères, so the short and lighter pieces. And the title goes on and says, "Et l'on fait voir l'importance de cette supériorité à la guerre." Right, so he was sustaining that basically there was some evidence in the current art of war, again, backed by military experience, of the validity of this notion. Something that, as we've seen, the marshals of France instead denied, right? By the way, he was backed in this by his same editors at the Royal Academy of Science, that was one of the most prestigious institutions in Europe, not, of course, like just in France. His work had been published, the aforementioned one. It's if you're interested, he discusses this in the second volume. This was published in Paris the year of his death in 1776. At an important date, of course, for other reasons, including the French, again, intervention in America once again. Now, in 1769, Vallière had, by the way, released his father's manuscript on subterranean warfare to reinforce his stance. This is also interesting because you see how these, again, noblemen, officers, commanders had, and we discussed this again a lot, all a series of so relatively extemporary literary creations that were not yet even to be simply published or rendered available to any specific institution. They were writing about them themselves. And Vallière, 7 years before dying, published this Traité de la défense de place par le contre-mine, which talks about counter-mining, essentially defending the stronghold fortresses, avec des réflexions sur le principe de l'artillerie. So with some reflections on the principle of artillery, again, Paris 1769, but it was a much older thing. And so the notion here was saying, I am Vallière, I'm the son of the great Vallière, I will publish some of that stuff that nobody has ever seen. So public opinion and, military observers will say, well, this is so cool, it's a piece of history, etc. But this was uniquely disconnected by definition, generationally at this point, from the current advancements in the art of war. So the new ordinance that reinstated Gribeauval's system stirred widespread international curiosity, by the way, because, of course, the system was new as well. So there may have been issues still with its application. And there were discussions, even spirited ones, among all European artillery experts, because, again, France does something like this, it's a huge deal. This Gribeauval's innovative car artillery would, however, go on to be fully appreciated, and it had immediately been understood it would have been something like this. You can read some of these authors, by the way, Ducourdray, L'artillerie nouvelle, ou examen des changements faits dans l'artillerie française depuis 1765, published in Liège, 1772. So there is all a history of these publications. As if you wonder where modern scholars study this stuff from, it's from this, at this point, as you understand, very abundant type of publishing that, in a sense, opens to a phase where not just, again, the military or the noblemen were reading this stuff. Of course, von Clausewitz also makes quite clear, so considering that the Funkriege would become much more popular among civilians than the military, the fellow military. On October the 3rd, 1774, the new ordinance was formally reestablished. Gribeauval was named first Inspector General, and so the Blues, the Blue faction, had finally won in their struggle over the Reds that faded away. However, there was one incident that still perhaps added a minimal satisfaction to the losing party. In fact, in 1770 at Vanves, Nicolas Joseph Cugnot inaugurated a steam-powered machine that crashed into the arsenal's boundary wall. The times are changing. Steam engine is there. Industrialization is kicking in, etc. Like, these are the first steps. The reason why this is relatively funny is that Cugnot was a former officer in the Austrian Army's engineering corps. So the one that would eventually be developed further by Gribeauval, etc. So he had been laboring since the 50s to devise a steam-driven vehicle for use as an artillery tractor, which is a very advanced mentality. We're talking the mid-18th century. We're already thinking how to propel guns by railway, which is, something that fundamentally kicked in only 1 century later at large. We have to look at the American Civil War, this kind of context, like to fully appreciate it. This tells you how advanced the French were, and this was definitely an anachronism. And evidently here the problem was not artillery nor Gribeauval, but it was funny to the Reds that this guy had been working so hard, like also close to Gribeauval with the Austrians and all that background, and this steam engine machine crashed into the arsenal's boundary walls. It's sort of an ominous thing. And in any case, a machine was actually built by Cugnot. It was also pretty interesting in size. It was just more than 7 meters and long and more than 2 meters wide. For the little weight of almost 3 tons, and capable of hauling, this was the most important aspect, 8 tons of cargo on a custom platform, right? So this is actually a lot, and it shows you how quickly also technological inventions can be found once you have steam engine existed since antiquity, for that matter, and we don't have to explain here how and why. Here we are in this kind of experimentations. We'll surely do it in another video, but the capacity to apply a technology to a broader system functionally, in this case for transporting artillery, ammo, etc., is another thing. Is a wholly different thing. At the time of Cugnot, of Gribeauval, of Vallière, they couldn't simply do that, right? And just think how, again, ahead, like railways will change the landscape of Europe and the world. In the mid-18th century, just imagine how the French countryside could be. It's something incredible if you think about it. But already they were thinking how to change this. Now, the tractor was undergoing these initial trials when Vallière's return to artillery leadership cut off all project funding, right? In fact, it had been abandoned for this reason, eventually being resumed when Gribeauval came back on track, I could say. So, again, a lot of enmity, a lot of feuds, a lot of issues that you can't understand only if you have an idea how much power these officers really had in their post. Artillery was not the only arm to be innovated. After all, we said it at the beginning. Artillery was actually less important than musketry fire, right? It would actually gain more importance throughout these decades, also thanks to the Gribeauval reform. From his side, again, we appreciated how the same Frederick the Great had to rethink the importance of artillery in this pounding function. It would be propedeutic to, in fact, the engagement of the other arms, and especially in siege warfare, but that's, again, another issue. In January 1763, the French War Ministry commissioned a fresh design from the workshops of Saint-Étienne, Maubeuge, and Charleville, an effort led with the objective of renovating and implementing the French line infantry musket. And during this effort, two craftsmen, Monsieur Boileau and Monsieur de Montbéliard, developed the initial version of what would later become the model 1763. The changes introduced were substantial, representing a sharp departure from earlier designs. Essentially, the stock shed its cumbersome cow's foot form, which had hindered aiming accuracy. The flintlock's hammer gained reinforcement through a dual metal band, and the barrel's total length was shortened. This debut model, dubbed Stainville after the war minister's title, Etienne François, Duke of Choiseul, at the time, that also bore the title Count of Stainville, remaining overly heavy at something like 4.6 kilos. After manufacturing 88,000 units, authorities opted to issue updated guidelines. And on March the 5th, 1766, a revised specification emerged, launching production of the model 1766. It actually was similar to the 1763 one, but it trimmed its weight to a mere 3.8 kilos. Right, which is still a lot, by the way. Normally, we've seen it very often in ancient medieval history. Basically, you don't wield something more than 3.5 kilos in battle. If anything, as as properly a melee weapon. So this is another story. Of course, these guys could and would use bayonets and so on. Let's say the musket can be reloaded, can be kept in different ways, like doesn't have necessarily to tire your arm all the time. It's still pretty heavy, but it's naturally much lighter than before. And it's so effective that a total of 300,000 were made, with many shipped, all including to the rebels in Britain's North American colonies. In fact, the Americans would come to know this gun pretty well. Rivalries between the Reds and the Blues that were still going on at that point spurred the development of 4 additional created the models 1770, 71, and 73 Vallière and the 1774 Inspecteurs Généraux. And this was the reflection of the aforementioned quarrels between the blues and the reds, to the point that, as you understand here, they were literally trying to change musket model at a few years' distance. This brought the war minister, the Count of Saint-Germain, to task Gribeauval with designing a weapon that unified the strengths of prior models. So Gribeauval was identified also as the guy that could solve sort of the most, unlike the technological, but also, as you understand here, broader administrative issues, so to say, given his authority and the very positive results that his artillery reform had produced. And so from 5 prototypes, the one crafted by Honoré Blanc, a Saint-Étienne Arsenal gunsmith, was selected. And so on February 26, 1777, specifications for the new rifle, christened the model 1777, were finalized. This weapon stretched 152 centimeters in length. Its seasoned wooden stock featured a butt devoid of the traditional 18th century fin, enhancing the shooter's ability to align their eye with the barrel's line, while a left side indentation improved cheek placement. There were lots of practical concerns with flintlocks at the time, including the fact that they could explode in your face from the guy shooting next to you, and some similar issues. Now, the flintlock was essentially refined from the 1763 model and incorporated a distinctive heart-shaped brace. The model 1777 stood as the zenith of flintlock rifles, prized not just for its durability and ease of upkeep, but also for its innovative production. This was, again, a great concern for the French that had to issue, again, large amounts of these guns. So it wasn't just a matter of, okay, well, we choose at some point, we do whatever we want. Not this thing has to be durable. It has to be, doesn't have to hinder properly movements, broader operation, because that is multiplied. It creates escalatory issues if they exist with individual soldier to the unit, to the level and further. And they have to be relatively cheap to be produced, although maintaining, of course, an important performance that would not be outshined by the enemies. So the French kingdom's arsenals received uniform gauges and templates, ensuring every component was swappable with others. This was very important. Again, further standardization issues, which are really new in the art of war. So much so that if you visit the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, you can still see the set of these measurements and templates in the inventory number P108 for checking individual part dimensions and realize in a world that was technically still pre-industrial, what was reaching the full industrialization, in the sense a level of standard uniformity for weapons, etc. However, still this this necessity of verifying how these guns were actually the issued ones, the ones that were necessarily to be alike like one another. And so you had all these various pieces that you had to compare with what you had, and basically recognize in case of was defective or counterfeited and whatever. The 1777 model is also beautiful to watch. Short, shiny. It's a great weapon. In 1775, Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier, the same guy who made the famous experiment, right, of proving that water was not an element, but a compound made of hydrogen and oxygen, right? And so, essentially leading him to understand, to discover the law of preservation of the mass and formulating even the atomic theory. These are the minds that were running the French military at this point. As Inspector General, in fact, of powders, unsurprisingly, given that he also made many experiments on combustion, he discovered, for example, that sulfur and phosphorus, when they burn, they absorb air. He discovered that combustion of a metal like quicklime brings it back to the simple state of metal. He proved that diamond burns in a closed container with pure oxygen, right? So all people that were highly refining the properly the instruments, the quality, the material, etc., to achieve extraordinary achievements. I partly discussed this in the video about von Clausewitz's Lives and Times, like all the main scientific discoveries of the year as well, among the various things. And again, science was skyrocketing in many ways, and that's also what informs von Clausewitz's mind. In any case, he was Inspector General of the powders for both the Army and the Navy, and he refined the gunpowder blend, cutting artillery charges further. Right, he understood how to make them, in that sense, burning more effectively. Right, that was always the older issue, right, of how to igniting powder more equally. If you think about the early Ottoman granulation of power, and so here the ammo was the artillery charges were ever more efficient, ever smaller, right? He also thus allowed for boosting personal weapon performance at the same time. And again, we don't even have to digress on this. The history of science is very fascinating. The latter 18th century saw extensive powder research aimed at elevating firearm ballistics. Everything was changing so fast. Not just in France, by the way. If you look, for example, at Savoy, you have names like Angelo Saluzzo di Monesiglio and Alessandro Vittorio Papacino d'Antoni, in particular from the doings of the Royal Society of Sciences of Turin. They published in other places as well, because they would write, at some point, even in French, they would publish in both in Turin and Paris at different stages. And even in England, again, they read the stuff, etc. And it mostly revolved around gunpowder, right? Firearms. These were all different treatises. Speaking of the service of artillery in time of war, you have, again, different. These were officers in the Sardinian army, right? Alessandro Vittorio Papacino d'Antoni was a major general in the Savoyard military and chief director of the Royal Military Academies of Artillery and Fortification at Turin. And again, also in London, they read this stuff. So it's quite interesting that Europeans are that intertwined in reading all about all these innovations and finding eventually new standards, new methods of verification and applicability of the new discoveries. Going back to our model 1777, it had an effective range of around 120 meters, which was deemed to be adequate for the time. It could be fitted with a socket bayonet strengthened by a sliding ring that would get the name of 5-foot clarinet, at least among the soldiers, and served with minor tweaks for 63 years until the percussion-based model 1840 debuted. So this is something that even outlived Gribeauval's artillery reforms, right? The musket went on more useful, and it makes sense because, of course, artillery is a bit more of a complicated thing, while musket technology at large, also in those decades, yes, would advance, but as you understand here, not too radically. And by the way, by the mid-70s of the 18th century, France had, in this whole show, boasted a premier army armed with the top flintlock musket ever made, backed by this outstanding cutting-edge artillery array from the Gribeauval system, again improved in everything, in maneuverability, in accuracy, in logistics, in literally the performance, like even a powder, excellent. Nothing had been lost in terms of siege warfare capacities. It was an improvement all around, demonstrating the greatness of French civilization. The 1777, its light uniform transport offered unrivaled off-road agility and robust firepower for infantry tactics. It's almost unthinkable that only 300 years had passed ever since field artillery that we document in our late medieval warfare content had just been brought there from the times of the Battle of Molinella, for example, where the sources literally say this is the first time a mobile artillery is introduced on the field. It's just 300 years. And here we're looking at almost 300 years ago. Just for saying, of course, a lot changed, but it seems to us to be so close. And indeed, it is, as much as slow, but also relatively fast for the times this artillery evolution had been. So even just think about the mental forms, how differently they, in speed, they change. By the way, the French cavalry too had been reshaped into a force rivaling Europe's finest. In fact, this was obvious considering the refinement of infantry and artillery, cavalry being even more important than artillery, for example. And all these improvements showed their best during the U.S. War of Independence, 1775-1783, where the French mostly made a show of their artillery. We'll talk more about that war. I made a general introductory video about the U.S. War of Independence. But let's put it in this way. The northern French harbor of Le Havre had an arsenal that prepared for the intervention in North America, a field artillery set to display, again, new French capacities. It's when, like in Empire Total War, you unlocked that, some of the last, artillery technology. You want to finally make all the new updated guns, and finally you recruit all at once, and you want to see them shooting at once. This was similar. I'm joking, of course, but the concept was the same. And this set consisted in, again, it's a moderate one, but obviously one adequate to the North American expedition. And of course, there were enormous costs that France was sustaining, as we were saying before, that would even eventually compound further the problems bringing to the revolution. 6 12-pounder cannons, 12 8-pounders, 52 4-pounders, 2 6-inch howitzers, and a siege array including 24 24-pounder cannons, 12 16-pounders, 6 8-inch howitzers, 8 12-inch mortars, 8 8-inch mortars, and 2 petards. And so if you look at North America, by 1780, the French had landed the following field artillery: 8 12-pounders, 16 4-pounders, and 6 6-inch howitzers. The siege park having 12 24-pounders, 8 16-pounders, 4 12-inch mortars, and 4 8-inch mortars. So you would say, but it's few. It's not few. It's actually, considering the scenario and the cost and how, new the stuff was, really actually a big deal. And so that's something you want to really appreciate, considering especially the difficulties that the French had in the previous period. And so sometimes on Schwerpunkt I get the sense that people hate the French for some reason, because there is either this antagonist. I will not say who does this or why, but of course if you... there is in pop culture dominated this, for example, sort of Anglo-centric antagonism towards the French, this pro-German attitude against the Romance world, etc. So France sucked at every time. No, France was really the finest military in European history historically at large, and so it can't be really downside. It's so huge just per se, and the accomplishment that the Gribeauval reforms brought about, that you can't fully understand just by that alone what a hell of a resourceful civilization France was, and hell of a military that they had at that point. And again, the French Revolution would have not succeeded. The Napoleonic Wars would have not happened with that astonishing French capacity hadn't the Gribeauval system been there. Even Napoleon would have been there without the Gribeauval reform, right? So I think that this video exemplifies well what are the difficulties in innovation. It's not just the discovery of a particular technology. Its applicability, it's the cost. Today we didn't talk costs. We've seen that tendentially the Reds wanted to get rid of this also for a matter of cost, right? The older system was, of course, cheaper, but it was also ineffective. So it's always the same old story. Do you want an adequate military? Do you want to be a normal country? Do you want to win wars? Do you want not to whine after that? Well, it's so simple, right? You have to make this effort. We know it costs, but it is what you must basically do. And so it's you can't really go anywhere. Besides, this the importance of the French military during the of the Gribeauval reforms is something that will say that the larger armies of the next level sort of armies in the art of war would graft themselves on, or at least would be served by in an excellent fashion. Again, the entire Napoleonic era went on with Gribeauval's guns and muskets. So that's something you really want to appreciate, and you also want to consider the difficulties in calibrating all this, like in the just the confidence that these practitioners to some degree really had, because the sense here is also how do you know that something is going to work? Well, these people were so confident in their intuitions, in their applications, in their experiment, in their military experience. Remember this, right? Gribeauval, as we've seen, was a guy that could hold the Prussians enough to thwart Frederick the Great's plans. So it's we're talking a figure that you just can't ignore. It's important also to see where other countries were during the same era, meaning that if you don't get here the magnitude of what was accomplished, you can't even properly get where the rest of, say, Europe and Europe at large was with all this. So it's a bit more than just a simple reform, right? The sense I get from these videos of receptions at times is, I will watch just what looks, I don't know, prejudicially aesthetic to a certain level of emotional attitude towards this or that country that people click on, right? And instead, you should learn how to understand what is objectively the quality of a power and another. This will be ever better explained as we're going to make more videos about the French Revolutionary Wars. I think never really made one on that. But obviously also how this really ties in with the change in times. Like we tend to see often the passage from the 18th to the 19th century. Okay, there was Napoleon, but it basically came back as it was before, right? It never went back, right? And everything changed, stepped up at a level that you may equivocate only if you do not know what a system was before and a system was after. And the military as such is perhaps the best indicator, or at least the one that, it's not the only one or the best, but the one that here we can see more easily if you have that familiarity and inclination. As a consequence, even when we talk von Clausewitz, again, we have to realize what happened to Prussia for von Clausewitz to write what he did and why it happened and what was going on, and considering also that Prussia had, again, this very fine military in its own, but one that eventually was surpassed by the times and more. Now, of course, we will continue to look at this stuff in some depth, but for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.